Alara's lungs burned as she tore through the dark trees, branches whipping across her face, her bare feet bleeding on the sharp stones hidden beneath dead leaves. Behind her, torches bobbed like angry fireflies through the fog, and the shouts of men grew louder with every second. She could still hear the elder's voice ringing in her ears, cold and final, calling her a curse upon the village. A girl touched by dark forces, simply because her mother had died the same night a strange light passed over the hills. She had done nothing wrong, yet somehow that no longer mattered. The mob had already decided her fate before she opened her mouth to defend herself, and so she ran, deeper and deeper into the forest, that every child in her village had been warned never to enter. The trees here grew thick and twisted, blotting out the moonlight until Alara could barely see her own hands. Thorns caught at her dress, tearing the fabric, but she did not dare slow down. Somewhere behind her, a man shouted that they had lost her trail, and for one heartbeat, she allowed herself to hope. Then a hound bayed in the distance, and her hope shattered instantly. She stumbled over a root, fell hard onto the damp earth, and forced herself back up before the pain could even register. Her chest heaved as she pressed a hand against a rotting tree trunk, trying to catch her breath, trying to think of anywhere to hide. That was when she saw it. A few steps ahead, where the ground dipped low, an old fallen tree had created a narrow hollow beneath its roots, half hidden by ferns and moss. It was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl into, but at this point, Alara had no other choice. She dropped to her knees and pushed herself inside, pulling loose branches over the opening as best as she could. Her whole body trembled as she pressed herself against the cold earth, listening to the distant shouts fade in and out with the wind. Minutes passed like hours. Slowly, the voices grew farther away, moving in the wrong direction, and Alara allowed herself to breathe. She did not know how long she stayed curled in that hollow, shivering, waiting for the sound of footsteps that never returned. When the forest finally settled into an eerie silence, she closed her eyes, telling herself she would only rest for a moment. But exhaustion pulled her under before she could stop it, and sleep came fast and heavy, dragging her into darkness. She woke to the sound of something moving nearby, a slow, dragging noise accompanied by a low, pained groan. Every muscle in her body went rigid. She held her breath, straining her ears, trying to determine whether the hunters had found her after all. But the sound was different, animalistic, uneven, like something limping through the undergrowth. Slowly, carefully, she peered through the gap in the branches covering her hiding place. At first she saw only shadows, but then a shape emerged from the darkness, and Alara's heart nearly stopped. A wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, staggered into the small clearing just outside her hollow. Its gray fur was matted with blood along one side, and it moved with obvious pain, each step slow and uneven. Alara pressed herself further back into the hollow, terrified that any movement might draw its attention. But the wolf did not seem to notice her at all. It collapsed onto the ground only a few feet from her hiding place, its sides heaving with ragged breaths. For a long moment, Alara simply watched, frozen with fear. Every instinct told her to stay hidden, to wait until the creature either left or died, and to think only of her own survival. She had already lost everything else that night: her home, her family, her place among people she had once trusted. She told herself she owed nothing to a wild animal bleeding in the dirt. And yet, as she watched the wolf's chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven breaths, something in her chest ached in response. She thought of her mother, gentle and kind, who once nursed an injured bird back to health, despite the neighbors calling it a foolish waste of time. Her mother used to say that kindness cost nothing, and meant everything. Slowly, cautiously, Alara pushed aside the branches and crawled out of her hiding place. The wolf's eyes opened at the sound, locking onto hers immediately, but it did not growl or bare its teeth. It only stared at her with an intensity that felt almost human, as if it understood exactly who she was and why she had run into these woods. Alara's hands trembled as she inched closer, half expecting the animal to lunge at her throat at any second. But it remained still, watching her with something that looked strangely like patience. She noticed the wound then, a deep gash along its side, still bleeding steadily into the dirt. Without fully understanding why, Alara reached for the torn hem of her cloak and ripped away a long strip of fabric. The wolf flinched slightly as she pressed the cloth against the wound, but it did not snap at her, did not pull away. It simply lay there, allowing her hands to work, its golden eyes never leaving her face. She worked quickly, tying the makeshift bandage tight enough to slow the bleeding, whispering softly the entire time, the way she might speak to a frightened child. She told the wolf it was safe now, though she barely believed her own words given her situation. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and studied the animal properly for the first time. Its fur was a deep, ashy gray, streaked with darker patches along its back, and its build was larger and more powerful than any wolf she had heard described in the old hunting stories. Something about its eyes unsettled her, not with fear, but with a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had looked into eyes like these before, though she could not place where. She shook the thought away, telling herself exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. Night stretched on, and neither the girl nor the wolf moved far from each other. Alara remained close enough to keep watch over the wound, occasionally checking the makeshift bandage to make sure the bleeding had slowed. The wolf, in turn, seemed to be watching her just as carefully, its ears flicking toward every distant sound in the forest, as though standing guard, even while lying wounded on the ground. At one point, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and the wolf's head snapped up instantly, a low growl rumbling in its throat, body tensing despite its injury. Alara froze, certain the hunters had found her at last. But after a tense moment, the wolf relaxed again, and no one emerged from the trees. She realized, with a strange mixture of relief and confusion, that the wolf had been protecting her, not threatening her. As the hours passed, Alara found herself talking quietly to the creature, more to calm her own nerves than out of any expectation of being understood. She spoke about her village, about the accusations that had been thrown at her without proof, about the mother she had lost, and the father who had turned away from her out of fear of the crowd. She spoke about how alone she felt, more alone than she had ever been in her life, and how strange it was that the only creature offering her comfort tonight was a wild, wounded animal in the middle of a forbidden forest. The wolf listened, or at least it seemed to, tilting its head slightly whenever her voice cracked with emotion, its golden eyes softening in a way she could not quite explain. Alara did not know it, could not have possibly known it, but every word she spoke was understood perfectly. The wolf lying before her was no ordinary beast, though his voice remained locked away behind fur and fangs he could not shed, at least not yet, not under this moon. He listened to her every word with an aching heart hidden deep inside a creature's body, wishing desperately he could tell her that she was not as alone as she believed, that someone finally understood the unbearable weight of being cast out unfairly by people who once claimed to care. As the first hints of gray light began creeping through the canopy above, exhaustion finally overtook Alara again. She curled up near the base of the fallen tree, closer to the wolf than she probably should have allowed herself to be, and let her eyes fall shut. The wolf remained awake long after her breathing steadied into the slow rhythm of sleep, watching over her through the fading darkness, his body aching from the wound she had so carefully treated, his heart aching from something far deeper than any wound could reach. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers still waited beyond these trees, he silently promised himself one thing. He would not let anything harm the girl who had shown him kindness, when the whole world outside these woods had shown him only cruelty. The forest around them grew quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alara slept without nightmares chasing her through the darkness. When morning finally broke through the heavy canopy, pale light filtered down in thin golden threads, touching the moss and ferns with a softness that felt almost unreal after the terror of the night before. Alara woke slowly, her body stiff from the cold ground, her mind foggy with confusion, for a brief moment, before the memories came rushing back. The mob, the torches, the running. Her heart lurched painfully, and she sat up fast, half expecting to find herself surrounded by angry villagers. Instead, she found only the quiet forest, and beside her, still resting near the fallen tree, the great gray wolf. He was awake, watching her with those same steady golden eyes, as though he had never once looked away the entire night. Alara let out a shaky breath, unsure whether to feel relieved or unsettled by how closely he seemed to be studying her. She examined the bandage she had tied around his wound, and was surprised to see the bleeding had stopped completely, the fabric now dry and stained a deep rust color. Whatever pain the wolf had suffered the night before, he appeared far more alert now, his breathing steady, his posture less strained. Alara knew she could not stay in one place for long. The hunters searching for her would not give up easily, not when the elder had convinced them she was dangerous, a threat that needed to be found and dealt with before she could bring misfortune upon the village. She rose to her feet, brushing dirt and leaves from her torn dress, and glanced nervously into the trees surrounding the small clearing. Every shadow looked like a hiding hunter. Every distant bird call sounded like a signal passed between searchers. She took a few uncertain steps away from the hollow, intending to press deeper into the forest, where she might find water or shelter, but a low sound stopped her in her tracks. The wolf had risen, despite his injury, moving carefully to stand between her and the direction she had been walking. His ears were pinned back, his nose lifted slightly into the wind, testing the air for something she could not detect. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, uncertain what the animal sensed, but she trusted the warning in his stance enough to freeze completely. After a long moment, the wolf relaxed slightly, though he did not move away from his position near her. Ilara studied him carefully, noticing again how unusually intelligent his eyes seemed, how deliberately he seemed to be making choices, rather than simply reacting on instinct. She had grown up hearing stories about the forest, tales meant to frighten children into staying close to home, stories of creatures that were not entirely animal, and not entirely something else. She had always dismissed them as nonsense, meant to keep young girls from wandering too far. Now, staring into the wolf's eyes, she found herself wondering, just for a moment, if those old stories held more truth than she had ever imagined. She pushed the thought aside, telling herself exhaustion and fear were clouding her judgment. Whatever the wolf was, ordinary or otherwise, he had not harmed her, and in a night filled with betrayal and danger, that alone made him more trustworthy than most people she had known. She decided, cautiously, to let him lead the way, since he seemed far more aware of the forest's dangers than she could ever be. They moved slowly through the trees together, the wolf limping slightly but managing well enough, always positioning himself a few steps ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure she followed. Ilara kept her eyes on the ground, watching for roots and stones that might trip her tired feet, while also straining her ears for any sign of pursuit. The forest seemed endless, one stretch of twisted trees blending into another, yet somehow she felt less afraid with the wolf beside her than she had felt alone the night before. By midday, they reached a small stream, its water clear and cold as it tumbled over smooth gray stones. Ilara knelt immediately, cupping her hands to drink, her throat raw from thirst she had barely noticed until now. The wolf lowered his head beside her, lapping at the water only a few feet away, close enough that she could hear his steady breathing over the soft rush of the stream. For a moment, the danger of the previous night felt distant, almost unreal, replaced by a strange, fragile peace between a frightened girl and a wounded wolf, who, for reasons she could not explain, had chosen to stay by her side. She did not know that somewhere deeper in these woods, a cursed man watched the sun rise and set through a wolf's eyes, counting the days until the one night each month when his true form might return to him, dreading the moment she might discover the truth, yet already unwilling to imagine these woods without her in them. The stream had barely quenched their thirst when a distant sound sent a jolt of fear through Ilara's chest, the unmistakable snap of dry branches breaking under heavy boots, followed by the low murmur of men's voices carried on the wind. She scrambled back from the water, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might give her away on its own. The wolf's head snapped up instantly, ears swiveling toward the sound, body going rigid with an alertness that made her stomach twist with dread. Without warning, the wolf pressed his body against her side, nudging her firmly toward a cluster of thick bushes a few paces away. Ilara understood immediately, and dropped low, crawling into the tangled branches as quietly as she could manage, ignoring the scratches against her arms. The wolf did not follow her into hiding. Instead, he moved in the opposite direction, deliberately snapping a twig loudly enough to draw attention, then trotting away from her hiding spot with obvious purpose. Ilara pressed a hand over her mouth, watching through the gaps in the leaves as two men emerged from the trees, both carrying spears, their faces hard and determined. She recognized one of them instantly, a broad-shouldered man named Gareth, who had once helped repair her family's roof after a storm. Now his eyes held nothing but grim suspicion as he scanned the clearing, his companion sniffing the air like a hound catching a scent. "Take a look near the water," the second man said, his voice low but carrying easily in the quiet forest. "Girls do not vanish into thin air. She has to be resting somewhere close." Alara's blood turned cold. She pressed herself flatter against the earth, praying the bushes would hide her completely, praying her own breathing would not betray her position. Through the leaves, she saw Gareth take a step toward the stream, dangerously close to where she crouched, his spear lowered, but ready. Just as he seemed about to turn in her direction, a low growl rumbled from somewhere across the clearing, deep and menacing enough to make both men freeze. The wolf had positioned himself in plain sight, deliberately, his wounded side facing away from the men, his teeth bared in a display meant to look far more threatening than his injury actually allowed. Gareth's companion cursed under his breath and raised his spear immediately, taking a cautious step backward. "That is a big one," he muttered. "Careful, Gareth. That beast looks ready to charge." Alara watched in horror as the wolf took a single step forward, snarling loudly, drawing every ounce of the men's attention toward himself and away from her hiding place. Gareth hesitated only a moment before raising his own spear, his focus locked entirely on the wolf, now standing between them and the stream. "We are not here for wolves," Gareth called out, though his voice wavered slightly with unease. "Back off, and we will leave you be." The wolf did not retreat. Instead, he let out another warning growl, low and steady, forcing both men to take several more steps backward toward the tree line. Alara's chest ached with a desperate need to help him, to do something, anything, but she knew any movement now could ruin everything he was risking for her sake. She could only watch, frozen with fear, as the standoff continued. Finally, after a long, tense pause, Gareth muttered something to his companion, and the two men began retreating deeper into the trees, clearly unwilling to risk injury over an animal that offered them nothing. "She is probably long gone from here anyway," she heard him say as their footsteps faded. "Best to search closer to the eastern ridge instead." Only when their voices disappeared completely did the wolf finally lower his head, his tense posture relaxing all at once. He turned back toward the bushes where Alara remained hidden, limping slightly from the strain of standing so firmly on his injured leg. Alara pushed herself out from the branches the moment she was certain the men were gone, rushing toward him with tears stinging her eyes. "You could have been killed," she whispered, kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his side for any fresh injury from the encounter. "Why would you do something so reckless for me?" The wolf simply leaned his head gently against her shoulder, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it stole the breath from her lungs. She wrapped her arms around his neck without thinking, burying her face in his fur, allowing herself, for just a moment, to cry out all the fear and exhaustion she had been holding inside since the moment the mob first turned against her. They stayed like that for several long minutes, the girl and the wolf, until her tears finally slowed and her breathing steadied. When she finally pulled back, she studied his face carefully, noticing again that strange, knowing look in his golden eyes, as though he understood every word of grief she had just poured out, as though he wished desperately he could answer her with more than silence. "We should keep moving," she said eventually, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "They said something about an eastern ridge. We need to go the opposite way." The wolf rose immediately, falling into step beside her, as she picked a careful path deeper into the unfamiliar woods. As they walked, Alara found herself talking again, quietly, almost without meaning to, telling him about her childhood, about summers spent gathering berries with her mother before illness took her away, about the quiet ache of watching her father grow distant and cold in the years that followed. She spoke about how the villagers had always treated her with a wary politeness, never quite trusting her, as though her mother's mysterious death had marked her somehow, long before the accusations of witchcraft ever began. The wolf listened to every word, matching his pace to hers, occasionally glancing up at her face whenever her voice grew tight with emotion. Alara found comfort in the listening, even if she told herself repeatedly that he could not possibly understand the meaning behind her words, only the tone of her voice. It did not matter. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt as though someone, or something, genuinely cared whether she lived or died. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the forest floor, they came upon the ruins of an old stone structure, half swallowed by ivy and moss, its walls crumbling, but still offering shelter from the wind. Alara hesitated at the entrance, unsure what might be waiting inside, but the wolf walked forward confidently, sniffing the corners, before settling near what remained of a collapsed hearth. Taking that as reassurance, Alara followed him inside. grateful for solid walls after a full day of exposed wilderness. As night approached once more, she gathered dry branches and leaves, building a small fire with trembling hands, and the flint she always carried, sparked more from habit than any real hope. The wolf watched her work, occasionally nudging additional kindling toward her with his nose, almost as though helping her complete the task faster. When the flames finally caught, casting warm light across the crumbling stone walls, Ilara let out a long breath, feeling something close to safety, for the first time since her world had fallen apart. She settled close to the fire, the wolf lying near enough that his warmth reached her despite the cold night air seeping through the broken walls. As exhaustion pulled at her eyelids, she found herself whispering one final thought, before sleep claimed her completely. "I do not know what you are," she murmured softly, running her fingers gently through the fur along his neck, "but I am glad you found me." The wolf's ears flicked at her words, and though he made no sound in response, something in his chest tightened painfully, a mixture of guilt and longing, so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. He watched her sleep peacefully beside the dying fire, wishing more than anything that he could tell her the truth, wishing he could explain the curse that kept his voice locked behind fur and silence, wishing he could promise her that whatever came next, he intended to keep her safe, no matter the cost to himself. Outside the ruined walls, the forest settled into its nightly stillness, unaware of the growing bond forming between a hunted girl and the cursed man hidden inside a wolf's body, both of them carrying secrets and sorrows heavier than either had spoken aloud, both of them finding, in each other, the first genuine comfort they had known in longer than they cared to admit. The fire had burned down to soft embers by the time Ilara stirred again in the middle of the night, a faint sound pulling her from sleep. She blinked against the darkness, momentarily disoriented, before realizing the wolf beside her had shifted position, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the broken doorway of the ruin. She held perfectly still, listening, and after a moment, she heard it too, a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps moving carefully through fallen leaves outside. Her pulse quickened instantly, fear flooding back into her chest. She reached out and gripped a fistful of the wolf's fur, silently pleading with him to stay close. He responded by rising slowly, careful not to make a sound, positioning his body directly between her and the doorway. Together they waited, unmoving, as the footsteps drew closer, then paused just outside the crumbling entrance. A shape appeared in the gap, silhouetted faintly against the moonlight, and for one terrifying moment, Ilara believed the hunters had finally found them. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized the shape was far too small to be a man, low to the ground and moving with a careful, deliberate grace. A fox, sleek and curious, poked its head through the opening before freezing at the sight of the wolf's glowing eyes staring back at it from the darkness. With a startled yelp, the fox turned and darted away into the night, leaving only silence in its wake. Ilara let out a shaky breath, feeling almost foolish for the fear that had gripped her so completely. The wolf relaxed as well, though he remained close beside her for the rest of the night, refusing to fully rest until the first hints of dawn began creeping through the cracks in the stone walls. She realized, watching him through half-closed eyes, that he had not slept at all, choosing instead to keep constant watch over her through every hour of darkness. When morning finally arrived, Ilara woke feeling more rested than she had expected, grateful for the strange, silent guardian who had kept danger at bay through the long night. She studied his face in the pale morning light, noticing new details she had missed before, the faint scars along his muzzle, the unusual intelligence behind his steady gaze, the way he seemed to watch her expressions, as though genuinely trying to understand her feelings, rather than simply reacting to sound and movement. "You are not like any wolf I have ever heard stories about," she said quietly, half expecting no response, yet somehow still speaking to him as though he might answer. The wolf tilted his head slightly at her words, a gesture so thoughtful and deliberate that a small shiver ran down her spine. For a fleeting moment, she wondered again about the old forest tales her grandmother used to whisper by candlelight, stories of men cursed by old magic to wear the skin of beasts, punished for crimes they did or did not commit. She had always considered such stories nothing more than entertainment meant to frighten restless children into obedience. Yet here, in the quiet ruins of a forgotten building, surrounded by an ancient forest that seemed to hold secrets of its own, those old stories no longer felt quite so impossible. She pushed the thought aside once more, telling herself that whatever the truth might be, she owed her survival to this creature, regardless of what he truly was. Rising to her feet, she gathered what little supplies she carried and prepared to continue deeper into the unfamiliar woods, uncertain of her destination, but certain of one thing only, that she could not return to the village that had turned against her so completely. The wolf rose alongside her, his injury visibly healing already, his steps steadier than they had been the day before. Together, they stepped out from the ruined shelter and back into the vast whispering forest, neither of them aware of how deeply their fates had already become entangled, nor of the dangers and revelations still waiting for them both in the days ahead. 3 days passed in the depths of the forest, each one blending into the next through long walks, careful foraging, and cautious rest beneath whatever shelter they could find. Alara had grown leaner from the effort, her dress torn further at the hem, her hands scratched from gathering berries and roots to keep hunger at bay. Yet despite the hardship, she found herself feeling something she had not expected to feel again, so soon after losing everything: a fragile sense of safety, built entirely around the presence of the wolf who never strayed far from her side. It was on the third evening, while she knelt beside a shallow creek washing dirt from a handful of wild roots, that she first noticed something that unsettled her deeply. She had been humming softly to herself, an old tune her mother used to sing while working, when she glanced up to find the wolf watching her with an expression so focused, so undeniably thoughtful, that it sent a shiver down her spine. Animals did not look at people the way he was looking at her now. There was recognition in his eyes, understanding, something far beyond simple animal curiosity. "You know that song, do you not?" she said quietly, more to herself than to him, testing a theory she barely dared to consider. The wolf's ears twitched, and his head tilted slightly to one side, an unmistakable response to her words rather than mere sound. She set the roots aside and moved closer to him, studying his face with new intensity. "Blink twice if you understand me," she said softly, feeling foolish even as the words left her mouth. For a long moment nothing happened, and she began to feel embarrassed by her own imagination. Then, deliberately, unmistakably, the wolf blinked twice, holding her gaze the entire time. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She sat back on her heels, staring at him with a mixture of astonishment and unease. This was no ordinary wolf, no matter how she tried to explain it away. Something about him was deeply, impossibly different, and though every instinct told her she should be afraid, she found instead that her heart ached with sympathy for whatever burden he seemed to be carrying in silence. "Are you cursed?" she asked, barely above a whisper, recalling once more the old stories her grandmother used to tell. The wolf's entire body went still at the question, his golden eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that answered her more clearly than words ever could have. Slowly, deliberately, he blinked twice again. Tears pricked at the corners of Ilara's eyes, though she could not have explained exactly why the confirmation moved her so deeply. She reached out and gently cupped his face between her hands, feeling the coarse fur beneath her fingers, searching his eyes, as though she might find the man trapped somewhere behind them, if she looked hard enough. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "Whatever happened to you, whatever cruelty brought you to this, I am sorry." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I know what it feels like to be punished for something you did not choose. I understand that pain better than you might think." The wolf leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly, as though her words offered a comfort he had not felt in a very long time. When he opened them again, something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding forming in the quiet space, where words could not yet pass between a girl and a creature bound by magic neither of them fully understood. From that moment forward, Ilara stopped questioning whether the wolf could understand her. She spoke to him openly now, without hesitation, sharing thoughts she had never voiced aloud to another living soul. She told him about the night her mother died, how she had woken to strange lights outside her window, and her mother's cold, still body beside her the following morning, how the villagers had whispered ever since that something unnatural had taken her, planting seeds of suspicion that would eventually grow into the accusations that destroyed her life. The wolf listened intently to every word, his expression shifting subtly with each revelation, sorrow and anger flickering behind his golden eyes in ways she found herself reading more easily with each passing day. She began to notice small gestures that seemed deliberately meant to communicate, the way he nudged a particular direction when he sensed danger, The way he pressed his head against her hand when her voice grew thick with grief. The way he positioned himself protectively whenever the wind carried unfamiliar scents through the trees. On the fourth morning, they encountered a wild boar blocking their path near a narrow ravine, its tusks lowered in aggressive warning as it guarded what appeared to be a den nearby. Elara froze immediately, uncertain how to proceed, but the wolf stepped forward without hesitation, positioning his body between her and the threat. He did not attack, but instead let out a series of low, measured growls, his posture radiating calm authority rather than aggression. Remarkably, after a tense standoff, the boar retreated, grunting irritably as it disappeared back into the undergrowth. "That was not luck," Elara said afterward, staring at him with open admiration. "You knew exactly what to do. You have done this before. Protected someone before, have you not?" The wolf held her gaze for a long moment before looking away, a gesture so filled with quiet sorrow that Elara immediately regretted the question, sensing she had touched on something painful. She did not press further, choosing instead to rest a comforting hand along his back as they continued walking, silently promising herself she would learn his story eventually, whatever tragic circumstances had led him to this cursed existence. As the days continued, small moments accumulated between them, building a bond neither had expected to form under such dire circumstances. Elara found herself laughing again, quietly at first, then more freely, whenever the wolf did something unexpectedly clever, like nudging a particularly stubborn berry bush until the fruit fell within her reach, or curling protectively around her during the coldest hours of night, sharing warmth without being asked. In turn, she noticed subtle changes in him as well, a certain lightness in his posture whenever she smiled, an eagerness in his step whenever she called his borrowed name. She had taken to calling him Shadow, a name that felt fitting given how constantly he remained by her side, always present, always watching, always ready to disappear into the darkness the moment danger threatened. She had no way of knowing his true name, the name given to him before the curse stripped away his voice and his humanity, and so Shadow became the identity she attached to the creature who had become, in a matter of days, the closest companion she had ever known. The wolf accepted the name without complaint, though something in his chest twisted painfully every time she spoke it, wishing desperately that circumstances allowed him to offer his true name in return. He had been Kale once, a name spoken with respect among his people, before betrayal and false accusations stripped that identity away, leaving him with nothing but a borrowed name given by a girl who had no idea how deeply her kindness was healing wounds far older than the physical injury she had first treated. By the fifth evening, they had settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful, despite the constant underlying danger of discovery. Elara had grown skilled at reading Shadow's subtle signals, understanding when he sensed danger nearby, when he wanted her to rest, when he simply wished to sit quietly beside her as the sun set behind the endless trees. She spoke to him constantly now, filling the silence between them with stories, questions, and quiet reflections on the strange, painful path that had led her into these woods. "Do you think we will ever find safety?" she asked one evening, watching the last light fade behind the horizon, while Shadow rested his head against her knee. "I do not know where we are heading, or what waits for us beyond these trees, but somehow, being here with you feels safer than anywhere I have been in longer than I can remember." The wolf's eyes lifted to meet hers, filled with an emotion so deep and complicated that Elara found herself unable to look away. Whatever answer he wished to give her, whatever truth remained locked behind silence and fur, she understood instinctively that his feelings mirrored her own completely. Whatever came next, whatever dangers still lurked in the shadows of this ancient forest, neither of them intended to face it without the other by their side. As night fully settled over the trees, Elara leaned back against a smooth boulder, allowing herself a rare moment of genuine peace. Shadow curled protectively beside her, his breathing steady and calm, his presence a constant reassurance against the uncertainty of everything else in her shattered world. Neither of them spoke, not that one of them truly could, but in the comfortable silence between them, an understanding continued to deepen, one built not on words but on trust, patience, and the quiet, growing affection of two souls who had found unexpected refuge in each other amid the wreckage of everything they had lost. Later that night, long after Elara had drifted into sleep, Shadow remained awake, staring up at the fragments of starlight visible through the canopy above. He thought about the life he had lost, the pack that had once called him brother, the elders who had believed lies over truth and cast him out with a curse, meant to punish him for a crime committed by another. He thought about the loneliness of the past year, wandering these woods with no voice, no companionship, nothing but the slow, aching passage of time, marked only by the changing moon. And then he thought of Alara, of the fierce kindness she had shown a wounded wild creature without hesitation, of the way she spoke to him, as though his opinion mattered, as though he was still a person worth confiding in despite his silence. He realized, watching her sleep peacefully beside him, that somewhere over these past few days, the crushing loneliness that had defined his cursed existence had begun to soften, replaced by something he had not expected to feel again, a fragile, tender hope that perhaps his existence still held purpose, even trapped within this borrowed, silent form. He did not know yet how he would ever explain the full truth to her, how she would react upon learning that the creature she called Shadow was, in fact, a man capable of speech and thought identical to her own. He only knew that whatever came next, whatever risks that truth might bring, he owed her honesty eventually, not deception disguised as protection. For now, though, he allowed himself simply to watch over her through the quiet hours of night, treasuring the fragile peace they had built together, unaware of how quickly that peace would soon be tested by forces neither of them could control. Kale had once been a proud member of a pack that ruled the northern hills long before Alara had ever set foot in these woods, a pack bound together by loyalty, tradition, and ancient laws passed down through countless generations. He had trained since childhood to become a protector among his people, respected for his strength and admired for his fairness, a young man with a bright future ahead of him and a family who believed deeply in his character. That future had shattered in a single night, destroyed by a betrayal so calculated that even now, over a year later, he still struggled to fully comprehend how thoroughly his own trust had been used against him. The crime had belonged to his closest companion, a man named Peter, who had grown up alongside Kale since childhood, sharing every triumph and hardship together as brothers might. Peter had broken the sacred laws of their pack, stealing precious resources meant to sustain the community through the harshest winter months, resources that ultimately vanished along with several innocent lives lost to starvation as a result. When the elders demanded answers, Peter had shifted blame entirely onto Kale, presenting fabricated evidence with a level of cunning that left the elders utterly convinced of Kale's guilt. Kale had pleaded his innocence with everything he possessed, but the evidence against him seemed damning, and Peter's testimony, delivered with practiced sorrow and false reluctance, sealed his fate completely. The elders, bound by ancient law, cursed him that very night, banishing him from the pack and stripping him of his ability to return to human form, except during the single night each month, when the moon disappeared completely from the sky. He had watched Peter's face during the sentencing, catching just a flicker of guilt hidden behind carefully constructed relief, confirmation enough that his oldest friend had orchestrated his downfall entirely for personal gain. The following year had been the loneliest period of Kale's entire existence. He wandered the forest without purpose, unable to speak, unable to explain himself to anyone who might have believed him, forced to watch from a distance as Peter rose in status within the pack, using the resources and reputation he had stolen to build a life that rightfully should have belonged to Kale instead. The bitterness of that betrayal had settled deep into his chest, a wound that refused to heal no matter how much time passed. He had considered, on several dark occasions, simply giving up entirely, allowing the wilderness to claim him the way it claimed so many creatures unable to survive its harsh demands. But something inside him, some stubborn refusal to let injustice define the entirety of his existence, had kept him moving forward, kept him surviving through sheer determination alone. And then, on a night that began like any other, wounded and desperate after a confrontation with a territorial rival, he had stumbled upon a girl, hiding beneath a fallen tree, a girl running from injustice remarkably similar to his own. Something about Alara's situation had struck him immediately, the parallel too significant to ignore. Here was another soul condemned unfairly, punished for circumstances entirely outside her control, forced into exile by people who valued convenient blame over genuine truth. He had recognized, almost instantly, a kindred spirit in her desperate flight through these woods, and something deep within him had refused to let her face that injustice entirely alone, regardless of the risk to his own already fractured existence. Now, days later, watching her sleep peacefully beside him under the vast canopy of stars, Kale found himself wrestling with an increasingly difficult decision. He knew the curse would lift briefly on the coming moonless night, granting him a few precious hours in his true human form, before dawn forced the transformation back into a wolf once more. He had experienced this monthly reprieve alone for the past year, wandering silently through the darkness, as a man before the curse reclaimed him each time. But this time, for the first time since his banishment, he would not be alone during those hours. The thought terrified him more than any physical danger the forest could offer. If Alara woke and found a stranger sitting where her wolf companion should be, how could he possibly explain himself in the brief hours available, before his voice and human form vanished again? Would she believe the impossible truth, or would fear and confusion drive her away entirely, leaving him to face his cursed existence more isolated than ever before? The uncertainty gnawed at him relentlessly as the days counted down toward the moonless night. He considered, more than once, deliberately separating himself from her before that night arrived, sparing her the shock and himself the risk of rejection. Yet every time he considered leaving, guilt overwhelmed him instantly. Alara remained in genuine danger, hunted by villagers who would show her no mercy if captured. Abandoning her now, purely to protect his own fragile hope of continued companionship, felt like a betrayal far worse than anything Peter had done to him. He owed her protection, regardless of his personal fears, and so he resolved to remain by her side, no matter what revelations the coming night might force between them. Days passed in careful preparation. Though Alara remained entirely unaware of the significance approaching, she continued sharing stories with him, growing more comfortable and open with each passing hour, treating him less like a wild animal, and more like a trusted companion, capable of genuine understanding. Kale cherished every moment of that growing trust, even as anxiety about the coming revelation twisted uncomfortably in his chest. One afternoon, while resting beside a quiet clearing filled with wildflowers, Alara reached out and gently stroked the fur along his neck, her expression thoughtful and distant. "I keep wondering about the curse," she said softly. "If there is a curse upon you, surely there must be some way to break it. Every story I have ever heard about such things always includes some path toward freedom, however difficult that path might be." Kale's ears perked at her words, his heart aching with the desperate hope that perhaps she was right, that perhaps some solution existed for both their broken circumstances. He wished desperately he could speak, could share the details of his banishment, could seek her guidance on how such curses were typically broken, according to whatever old stories she might know. Instead, he simply pressed closer to her side, silently grateful that she seemed genuinely invested in his well-being, despite barely understanding the truth of his situation. "Perhaps," she continued, almost to herself, "whatever magic bound you requires proving your innocence somehow, or perhaps it requires someone standing beside you unconditionally, offering loyalty strong enough to counteract whatever cruelty created the curse in the first place." She paused, glancing down at him with a small, hopeful smile. "If that is the case, know that you already have my loyalty, Shadow, for whatever that might be worth against ancient magic." Kale's chest tightened with overwhelming emotion at her words, gratitude and longing mixing together so powerfully that he had to look away, afraid his eyes might betray more understanding than a simple wolf should possess. He wondered, not for the first time, whether her instincts about breaking curses held more truth than either of them yet realized, whether the growing bond between them might eventually prove significant enough to challenge the ancient magic that had stolen his voice and his humanity for over a year now. As the sun began setting behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the clearing, Alara rose to her feet, brushing wildflower petals from her torn dress. "We should find shelter before nightfall," she said, glancing around at the darkening forest. "I have a feeling about tonight, though I could not tell you why. Something feels different, like the woods themselves are holding their breath." Kale's heart skipped uneasily at her words, wondering if some instinct within her sensed the significance of the approaching moonless night, even without fully understanding why. He rose alongside her, leading the way toward a dense grove of trees that might offer adequate shelter, his mind racing with anxiety about what the coming hours might reveal, and how drastically everything between them might change once dawn finally arrived. Word of the missing girl had spread far beyond the borders of Alara's home village, carried by frightened travelers, and exaggerated with every retelling, until the entire region buzzed with rumors of a dangerous witch loose in the ancient forest. The village elder, a stern man named Edmund, who had convinced the community of Alara's guilt in the first place, organized a larger search party than before, offering a substantial reward to any hunter willing to venture deep into the forbidden woods and bring her back, dead or alive. Among those drawn by the promise of reward was a grizzled tracker named Walter, a man who had spent decades hunting the most dangerous creatures the wilderness had to offer, feared and respected throughout the region for his uncanny ability to follow even the faintest trail. Walter cared little for rumors of witchcraft, viewing the entire situation as simply another job to complete efficiently and collect payment for afterward. He gathered a small group of capable men and set out at dawn, determined to succeed where previous search parties had failed. Alara remained blissfully unaware of this new, more dangerous threat approaching, as she continued her days moving through the forest, alongside Shadow, growing more confident in their fragile safety, with each passing hour, that no hunters appeared. She had begun to hope, perhaps foolishly, that the search for her had finally been abandoned, that perhaps she and Shadow might eventually find some permanent shelter deep enough within these woods to escape detection entirely. That hope shattered on the 6th day, when Shadow suddenly froze mid-stride, his nose lifting sharply into the wind, ears pinning back with unmistakable alarm. Alara stopped immediately, her heart lurching with dread as she watched his reaction, sensing danger before she could even identify its source. "What is it?" she whispered, glancing around at the seemingly peaceful forest surrounding them. Shadow did not answer, could not answer, but his body language spoke clearly enough. He nudged her urgently toward a dense thicket of brambles, growling low in his throat as he scanned the trees for the source of whatever scent had alarmed him so completely. Alara obeyed without question, crouching low among the thorny branches, wincing as they scratched against her already torn dress. Moments later, she understood exactly what had triggered his alarm. Walter emerged from the tree line barely 30 paces away, moving with the careful, silent precision of a man who had tracked prey through wilderness for the majority of his life. 2 other men followed close behind him, weapons ready, eyes scanning every shadow, with professional wariness, entirely different from the clumsy panic of the previous search party. "This is her trail," Walter said quietly, kneeling to examine a partial footprint pressed into soft earth near the base of a tree. "Fresh, no more than a few hours old. She is close, gentlemen. Closer than Edmund's men ever managed to track her." Alara's blood ran cold at his words, realizing immediately that this hunter possessed skills far beyond anything she had encountered thus far. She pressed herself deeper into the thicket, praying the thorns would provide adequate concealment, while Shadow remained crouched low beside her, his muscles coiled with tension, ready to act the moment circumstances demanded it. Walter rose slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the surrounding forest with methodical precision, and for one horrifying moment, Alara felt certain his gaze had landed directly on their hiding place. She held her breath, willing herself invisible, while Shadow's low growl vibrated almost silently in his chest, a warning meant only for whatever threat might discover them. "There is something else here too," Walter murmured, his brow furrowing as he studied additional tracks pressed into the soft ground nearby. Wolf tracks, large ones, moving alongside her footprints rather than pursuing them. His companions exchanged uneasy glances at this observation. "That is unusual," one of them muttered. "Wolves do not typically travel beside prey unless something strange is happening." Walter said nothing for a long moment, studying the tracks with growing suspicion, before finally straightening and gesturing for his men to continue forward. "Whatever is happening, we will figure it out once we find the girl herself," he said firmly. "Spread out, but stay within shouting distance. This forest plays tricks on careless men." The 3 hunters moved forward cautiously, passing dangerously close to the thicket where Alara and Shadow remained hidden, close enough that she could hear the soft creak of leather boots and the faint jingle of equipment carried at their belts. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying silently, until finally the sounds began fading as the men continued deeper into the forest, thankfully moving in a direction that led them away from her actual hiding place. Only when the forest fell completely silent again did Alara dare release the breath she had been holding, her entire body trembling with residual fear. "That was too close," she whispered, glancing at Shadow with wide, frightened eyes. "That man tracks better than anyone who has come after us so far. We cannot stay in one place for long, not with him hunting us." Shadow nudged her gently, urging her to rise, his expression conveying an urgency she understood immediately. They needed to move, and quickly, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Walter's dangerously capable pursuit. As they emerged cautiously from the thicket and began moving deeper into unfamiliar territory, Elara found herself gripped by a fear more intense than she had felt since the very first night of her flight from the village. This hunter was different from the others, more patient, more skilled, entirely unwilling to give up the chase easily. She realized, with growing dread, that outrunning him indefinitely might prove far more difficult than evading the clumsy search parties that had come before. Whatever safety she and Shadow had built together over the past several days now felt more fragile than ever, threatened by a danger far more competent than anything they had faced thus far. As they hurried through the trees, putting distance between themselves and the tracker's dangerous pursuit, Elara glanced repeatedly at Shadow, drawing strength from his steady, protective presence beside her. Whatever came next, whatever new dangers Walter's relentless tracking might bring, she found comfort in knowing she would not face it entirely alone, though she remained completely unaware of just how significant that companionship was about to become as the moonless night finally approached. Night descended over the forest with an unusual heaviness, the sky above utterly devoid of moonlight, clouds thick enough to blot out even the faintest stars. Elara noticed the darkness immediately as they settled into a small hollow surrounded by protective boulders, remarking that she had never seen the forest quite this dark before. Shadow remained unusually restless beside her, pacing in tight circles, his golden eyes occasionally flickering toward the sky, with an anxiety she could not quite interpret. "You seem nervous tonight," she observed, watching him settle finally beside the small fire she had managed to build. "Is something wrong? Do you sense danger nearby?" Shadow only pressed closer against her side, his body trembling slightly with an emotion far more complicated than simple fear. He knew what tonight meant, knew that within a few hours, the curse binding him would loosen its grip just long enough to return his human form, and he had no way of preparing her for what she might witness before dawn reclaimed his silence once again. Exhaustion eventually overtook Elara despite her unease, and she drifted into sleep leaning against the boulder, her hand still resting gently on Shadow's fur. He remained awake long after her breathing steadied, watching the clouds above with a mixture of dread and desperate hope, counting the passing hours until he felt the first unmistakable pull of transformation beginning deep within his bones. The change came suddenly, painfully, a wrenching sensation that spread through every muscle as fur receded and bones reshaped themselves into an entirely different form. Kale gritted his teeth against the agony, forcing himself to remain silent despite the overwhelming pain, until finally, the transformation completed, and he found himself sitting in the darkness as a man once more, his bare skin exposed to the cold night air, his breathing ragged from the effort of the change. He glanced immediately toward Elara, relieved to find her still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the transformation that had just occurred mere feet away from her. He wrapped himself as best he could in a discarded portion of cloak left near their small fire, using the fabric to cover himself, while his mind raced with uncertainty about what to do next. Part of him wanted desperately to wake her immediately, to finally explain everything honestly rather than continuing the deception even a moment longer. But fear held him back, fear that the shock of discovering a stranger where her trusted companion should be might destroy the fragile trust they had built together. Instead, he settled quietly beside the fire, watching over her sleeping form with the same protective vigilance he had shown as a wolf, though now filled with an aching, human longing to finally speak the words he had wanted to share since that very first night in the hollow beneath the fallen tree. He studied her face in the firelight, noting details he had never fully appreciated through a wolf's eyes, the gentle curve of her features, the quiet strength evident even in her exhausted sleep, the faint scars along her hands from days spent surviving in unforgiving wilderness. Hours passed in this manner, Kale keeping silent watch while wrestling internally with the impossible decision of whether to wake her or continue hiding the truth until circumstances forced the revelation upon them both. As the first hints of gray light began creeping across the horizon, signaling that his brief window of humanity was rapidly closing, Elara stirred suddenly, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded her expression as she registered the absence of familiar fur beside her, replaced instead by the unmistakable silhouette of a man sitting just a few feet away. Her breath caught sharply, fear flooding through her instantly as she scrambled backward, putting distance between herself and this unexpected stranger. "Wait," Kale said quickly, his voice rough from disuse. "Please, do not be afraid." Alara froze at the sound of his voice, something achingly familiar in its tone, despite never having heard him speak before. Her eyes widened with dawning, impossible realization as she studied his face more carefully in the dim morning light, recognizing something in his golden eyes that mirrored the wolf she had trusted so completely over the past several days. "Shadow," she whispered, disbelief evident in her trembling voice. "It cannot be. This is not possible." "I know this seems impossible," Kale said gently, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening, aware of how frightening this revelation must appear to her. "But everything I have shown you these past days, every moment of protection, every quiet companionship, all of that was genuine, regardless of the form I wore while offering it." Alara stared at him, 1,000 emotions warring across her face simultaneously, fear and confusion mixing painfully with something that looked almost like betrayal. "You let me believe you were simply an animal," she said, her voice trembling with hurt. "All this time, you understood everything I said, every secret I shared, and you said nothing." "I could say nothing," Kale explained desperately, aware of the precious little time remaining before dawn forced his transformation back into silence. "A curse binds me, Alara, one that strips away my voice and my humanity, except for this single night each month, when the moon disappears completely. I wanted to tell you the truth. I wanted that more than anything, but I feared losing you the moment you learned what I truly was." Alara's expression softened slightly at his words, though confusion and hurt remained evident in her eyes. "Tell me everything," she said finally, her voice steadier now despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Tell me who you really are, and how this curse came to claim you." Kale took a deep breath, aware that dawn approached rapidly, stealing away his remaining time as a man. "I am called Kale," he began, "once a respected member of a pack far to the north of here, until a betrayal by my closest friend resulted in false accusations that led the elders to curse me, banishing me from my own people, and stripping away my humanity, except for these brief hours each month." He explained everything as quickly as circumstances allowed: the theft committed by his friend Peter, the fabricated evidence used to convince the elders of his guilt, the crushing loneliness of the past year spent wandering these woods trapped in wolf form, with no voice to defend himself or explain the truth to anyone. Alara listened intently, her expression shifting gradually from confusion toward sympathy as she absorbed the painful similarities between his situation and her own unjust exile. "We are more alike than I ever imagined," she said softly once he finished speaking. "Both punished for crimes we did not commit, both abandoned by people who should have trusted us." She hesitated, studying his face carefully. "Why did you protect me so fiercely then, a stranger who meant nothing to you when we first met?" "Because I recognized the same injustice in your situation that destroyed my own life," Kale answered honestly. "And because, somewhere over these past days, you became far more than simply a stranger to me. Alara, whatever form I wear, wolf or man, my feelings toward you remain unchanged. I care for you deeply, more than I expected to care for anyone again, after everything I have endured this past year." Before Alara could respond, the first painful pull of transformation gripped Kale's body once more, dawn finally arriving to reclaim his stolen humanity. He gasped sharply as bones and muscle began reshaping themselves once again, fur emerging rapidly across skin that had briefly belonged entirely to a man. Within moments, the transformation completed fully, leaving Shadow the wolf sitting once more, where Kale the man had briefly existed. Alara stared at him, tears gathering in her eyes. As she processed everything she had just learned, she reached out slowly, resting her hand gently against his fur, feeling the same familiar warmth, despite everything having changed between them in the span of a single conversation. "I understand now why you hid this from me," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "And I understand your fear that I might reject you upon learning the truth. But Shadow, or Kale, whichever name feels more true to who you are, know this. Nothing about what I just learned changes how grateful I am for your protection, or how much I have come to trust and care for you these past days." The wolf leaned into her touch, his golden eyes conveying gratitude and relief, so profound that words could not have expressed it more clearly. Whatever challenges still awaited them, Whatever dangers Walter's relentless pursuit still threatened, Ilara now understood completely the truth of her companion's cursed existence, and rather than driving her away, that knowledge only deepened her determination to help him find whatever path might eventually break the curse binding him so cruelly. In the days following that revelation, everything between Ilara and Kale shifted into something deeper and far more honest than before. Though he remained trapped in wolf form for all but a single night each month, she no longer spoke to him as though uncertain whether her words landed on understanding ears. She spoke directly to Kale now, sharing thoughts and fears with complete confidence that he comprehended every word, and in turn, she noticed him communicating more deliberately as well, developing small signals and gestures specifically meant to convey complex thoughts despite his silence. They developed a rhythm of movement, careful always to avoid open ground where Walter's tracking skills might spot them easily, sticking instead to rocky terrain and flowing streams that left little trace of their passage. Kale led them along paths only a creature with intimate knowledge of wilderness survival could navigate confidently, doubling back occasionally to confuse any trail that might have formed, always alert for the faintest scent or sound that might indicate their pursuers drawing near. Despite the constant danger, Ilara found herself experiencing something unexpected amid the fear and uncertainty, genuine happiness in Kale's company that went beyond simple gratitude for his protection. She found herself anticipating the rare moments when his eyes met hers with particular intensity, treasuring the small gestures of affection he offered, even trapped within wolf form, a gentle nudge here, a comforting presence there, a quiet loyalty that never wavered, regardless of circumstances. One afternoon, while resting beside a quiet pool fed by a small waterfall, Ilara found herself studying Kale's reflection in the still water, contemplating the unfairness of his situation with growing determination. There must be some way to break this curse, she said firmly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. I refuse to believe that ancient magic, however powerful, cannot be undone through equally powerful means. Kale's ears perked with interest at her words, though uncertainty clouded his expression. She continued thinking aloud, recalling scattered fragments of old stories her grandmother once told about curses and enchantments, stories that always seemed to include some path toward redemption, however difficult that path might prove. Perhaps proving your innocence to your former pack would break it, she suggested. Or perhaps an act of profound loyalty and sacrifice might counter whatever cruel intention shaped the original curse. She paused, studying his face carefully. Whatever the answer might be, know that I intend to help you find it, regardless of the danger or difficulty involved. You have protected me without hesitation since the very first night we met. I owe you the same unwavering commitment in return. Kale pressed his head gently against her hand, overwhelmed by the depth of loyalty she offered so freely, despite everything they still faced. Whatever path lay ahead toward breaking his curse, he found himself believing, for the first time since his banishment began, that perhaps such a path truly existed, and that perhaps, with Ilara beside him, he might actually find the strength to walk it successfully. Their peaceful moment was interrupted abruptly by a distant howl echoing through the trees, distinctly different from any sound Kale had made before. His entire body tensed immediately, ears swiveling toward the sound with unmistakable recognition. Ilara noticed his reaction instantly, alarm flooding through her. "What was that?" she asked urgently. "Do you recognize that sound?" Kale's expression darkened considerably, and he rose to his feet, positioning himself protectively between Ilara and the direction the howl had originated from. Something in his posture conveyed clear recognition, mixed with dread, though he had no way of explaining the significance of that particular howl without the ability to speak. Ilara understood only that whatever approached now represented a danger unlike anything they had encountered thus far, and she rose quickly to her feet, prepared to follow wherever Kale led, in order to escape whatever threat that distant howl had signaled. They moved swiftly through the forest, Kale setting a punishing pace despite his continued vigilance for any sign of pursuit, while Ilara struggled to keep up, her legs burning with exhaustion after days of constant movement through difficult terrain. Behind them, the howl sounded again, closer now, joined shortly afterward by a second voice calling in response, confirming Kale's worst fears about exactly who had found their trail. It was Peter, the very wolf whose betrayal had condemned Kale to his cursed existence in the first place, now apparently tracking them through these woods, alongside members of his own pack, likely sent to ensure Kale remained permanently banished, and unable to ever challenge the false accusations that had ruined his life. The realization struck Cale with cold, sinking dread, understanding immediately that this new threat combined with Walter's relentless human pursuit created a danger more severe than anything he and Alara had faced since their journey began. As the howls grew steadily closer, echoing through the darkening forest with increasing urgency, Cale understood that whatever safety they had built together over the past week now hung entirely in the balance, threatened by enemies from both the human world and his own former pack, converging simultaneously upon the fragile refuge he and Alara had carved out amid the ancient trees. They ran until the trees began thinning ahead, opening into a narrow ravine bordered by steep rocky walls on either side, a natural passage that offered no easy escape route once inside. Cale hesitated at the entrance, sensing the danger of becoming trapped within such a confined space, but the howls behind them had grown alarmingly close, leaving little choice but to press forward and hope the ravine eventually opened into safer terrain beyond. Alara's breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled over loose rocks, her legs trembling with exhaustion, while Cale remained close beside her, his ears constantly swiveling to track the approaching threat. They had covered perhaps half the length of the ravine when 3 wolves emerged onto the rocky ledge above them, silhouetted against the darkening evening sky, one clearly larger than the others and unmistakably familiar despite the distance separating them. Peter, Cale thought bitterly, recognizing his former friend immediately despite months of separation. The betrayer had grown stronger since their last encounter, his posture radiating confidence and authority that had clearly increased following Cale's banishment. Peter's eyes locked onto Cale instantly, a low growl rumbling from his throat as recognition dawned, followed swiftly by cold satisfaction at finding his former friend cornered so conveniently within the ravine. "You should not have left the Northern Territory," Peter's growl seemed to communicate, though no words passed between them, only the ancient language of posture and expression that wolves understood instinctively. Cale positioned himself immediately between Alara and the ledge above, his hackles raised, teeth bared in unmistakable warning, despite being significantly outnumbered by Peter's companions. Before the confrontation could escalate further, a new sound echoed through the ravine, human voices calling to each other, followed swiftly by the unmistakable figure of Walter, emerging from the opposite end of the passage, his weapon raised, expression sharp with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey after days of relentless pursuit. His companions flanked him closely, effectively sealing off any possibility of escape in that direction as well. Alara froze completely, trapped now between hostile wolves above and armed hunters ahead, her heart pounding with terror at the impossible situation unfolding around them. "There she is," Walter called out, his voice carrying easily through the narrow ravine. "And that wolf beside her again. Interesting company you have chosen for yourself, girl." Cale's mind raced desperately, calculating impossible odds against overwhelming threats from multiple directions simultaneously. He understood immediately that protecting Alara through this confrontation would require choices more dangerous than anything he had faced since his banishment began, choices that might ultimately cost him everything he had left, his freedom, his safety, perhaps even his life itself. Peter, sensing opportunity in the chaos of converging threats, leaped down from the ledge above, landing heavily on the rocky ground with practiced grace, positioning himself directly opposite Cale, while his 2 companions spread out to prevent any possibility of retreat. "This ends today, cousin," Peter's posture seemed to convey with cruel satisfaction. "You should have accepted your banishment quietly, instead of continuing to survive against every expectation." Walter, meanwhile, advanced cautiously from the opposite direction, his weapon steady despite clear uncertainty about how to handle the unexpected complication of hostile wolves, complicating what he had assumed would be a straightforward capture. "Whatever quarrel you beasts have with each other," he called out warily, "stay clear of my business here. I have no interest in wolf politics, only in completing my contract regarding the girl." Alara pressed herself instinctively against the rocky wall of the ravine, watching in terrified fascination as the impossible standoff unfolded around her, humans and wolves alike converging with entirely separate agendas that nonetheless threatened her safety equally. She realized, with dawning horror, that Cale now faced an impossible choice. Protecting her from Walter's men risked provoking Peter's pack into immediate attack, while defending against Peter's aggression left her exposed to Walter's approaching hunters. I will not let either of you take her, Kale's posture seemed to declare fiercely. His body coiled with tension as he prepared to face threats from multiple directions simultaneously, despite the clearly overwhelming odds against him. Whatever the cost to himself, he had already decided, days ago, that Alara's safety mattered more than his own survival, and nothing about this current impossible situation had changed that fundamental commitment. The tension in the ravine stretched unbearably as both threats closed in simultaneously, Peter's pack advancing with predatory patience from one direction, while Walter's men crept forward cautiously from the other, each group wary of the other's presence, yet equally determined to achieve their separate goals. Alara's mind raced desperately, searching for any possible solution to the impossible situation trapping them all within this narrow, rocky passage, understanding that whatever happened next would determine not just her own fate, but Kale's future as well, the ancient curse binding him, and whatever fragile hope remained of ever breaking free from the injustice that had shaped both their lives so completely. Peter made the first move, lunging toward Kale with the speed and confidence of a wolf who believed victory was already assured. Kale met the charge head-on, twisting aside at the last possible moment and using Peter's own momentum against him, sending his former friend crashing into the rocky wall of the ravine with enough force to daze him temporarily. The two remaining pack members hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to assist Peter immediately or wait for clearer opportunity. Walter, meanwhile, used the sudden chaos among the wolves to advance more aggressively toward Alara, his men fanning out to cut off any possible escape route. "Grab the girl," he barked to his companions. "Let the beasts settle their own business while we finish ours." Alara backed away instinctively, pressing herself against unforgiving rock, searching desperately for any path of escape that did not exist within this narrow, confined space. Kale sensed the shift in danger immediately, torn between defending against Peter's recovering aggression and protecting Alara from Walter's advancing men. He made his choice instantly, abandoning his defensive stance against Peter entirely, and lunging instead toward the nearest hunter approaching Alara, teeth bared in a display of aggression far more genuine than any warning growl he had offered previously. The hunter stumbled backward in alarm, tripping over loose stones as he retreated from Kale's sudden, fierce charge. Alara used the momentary distraction to scramble sideways, putting distance between herself and Walter's remaining men, though she remained trapped within the ravine with nowhere safe to retreat toward. Peter, recovering from his collision with the rocky wall, snarled furiously and charged again, this time catching Kale across the shoulder with sharp teeth before he could fully turn to defend himself. Pain exploded through Kale's body, but he refused to fall, refused to abandon his position protecting Alara, despite the wound now bleeding freely along his shoulder. He turned to face Peter directly, and something in his posture shifted, no longer purely defensive, but filled instead with the accumulated anger of an entire year spent suffering unjustly for a crime that belonged entirely to the wolf, now attacking him again. "You did this to me," Kale's fierce growl seemed to communicate as he met Peter's next charge with equal ferocity, refusing to be driven backward despite his injury. "You stole everything from me, my pack, my humanity, my very identity, and you have the audacity to hunt me now, as though I am the one who committed a crime." The two wolves collided violently, a whirlwind of teeth and claws and desperate fury, while Walter's men, momentarily distracted by the intensity of the wolf conflict, hesitated to press their advantage against Alara. She used the opportunity to snatch a fallen branch from the ground, gripping it tightly as a makeshift weapon, despite knowing how little protection it likely offered against armed hunters. The battle between Kale and Peter intensified, both wolves, bleeding now from multiple wounds, neither willing to concede despite the mounting toll of their fierce confrontation. Kale fought with a desperation born not just from physical survival, but from the accumulated weight of injustice, finally finding an outlet, after over a year of forced silence and helpless suffering. Peter, for his part, fought with the cornered viciousness of a wolf, who understood that losing this confrontation might finally expose the truth he had spent so long concealing from his own pack. Walter, sensing the wolves' battle providing convenient distraction, finally moved decisively toward Alara, his men closing in from multiple directions simultaneously. She swung her makeshift branch desperately as one hunter reached for her, striking his arm hard enough to force a pained grunt, but the numbers against her proved overwhelming, and within moments strong hands seized her arms, pinning them firmly despite her fierce struggle. "Let me go," she shouted furiously, twisting against the hunter's grip with every ounce of strength she possessed. Cale, hearing her cry despite the intensity of his own battle, felt something desperate and fierce ignite within his chest. With a burst of renewed strength drawn from pure determination, he finally overpowered Peter, pinning his former friend against the rocky ground with jaws positioned dangerously close to his exposed throat. Peter went utterly still beneath him, recognizing the vulnerability of his position, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by genuine fear. In that frozen moment, something shifted within Cale, a recognition that killing Peter here, in this desperate confrontation, would solve nothing regarding the deeper injustice that had shaped his cursed existence. Instead, with tremendous effort, he released his hold and stepped back, allowing Peter to scramble away in confused, wary retreat, his remaining pack members following closely behind him, apparently unwilling to continue the confrontation now that their leader had been so thoroughly humbled. With Peter's threat neutralized, Cale turned immediately toward Alara, finding her struggling desperately against Walter's men, who had begun dragging her toward the ravine's exit. Blood dripped from his wounded shoulder as he charged forward with everything remaining strength he possessed, positioning himself directly in Walter's path, with a snarl so fierce and desperate that even the experienced hunter hesitated momentarily. "Release her," Cale's entire posture demanded, though naturally no words accompanied the fierce declaration. Walter studied the wounded, exhausted wolf standing before him with grudging respect evident in his expression. "That is quite a loyal companion you have found for yourself, girl," he said, glancing toward Alara while his men maintained their grip on her arms. "Though loyalty alone will not save you from the fate awaiting you back in the village." Alara, despite her fear, found herself speaking with sudden fierce conviction. "Whatever fate awaits me," she declared loudly, "this wolf has shown me more genuine kindness and protection than the entire village that condemned me ever offered. If you drag me back to face false accusations, know that you do so against a creature who has proven far more honorable than the men who sent you here." Something in her impassioned words seemed to give Walter pause, his expression shifting subtly as he studied both the wounded, fiercely protective wolf and the determined girl standing defiantly, despite her captured circumstances. Whatever calculation passed through his experienced mind in that moment, the tension within the ravine hung suspended, uncertain, as everyone present awaited whatever decision the seasoned hunter might ultimately reach regarding the fate of both the hunted girl and her unlikely, cursed protector. Walter studied the scene before him for a long, tense moment, his weathered face unreadable as he weighed the fierce loyalty of the wounded wolf against the substantial reward promised for the girl's capture. Finally, he lowered his weapon slightly, though his men maintained their grip on Alara's arms, awaiting further instruction. "Tell me something, girl," he said slowly. "This elder who condemned you, Edmund, what proof did he actually offer of your supposed witchcraft, beyond mere suspicion and rumor surrounding your mother's death?" "None," Alara answered immediately, her voice steady despite her fear. "He needed no proof, only convenient blame, to explain a tragedy the village could not otherwise understand. I have done nothing wrong, sir. Nothing beyond surviving in a world quick to punish anyone different or unexplained." Walter's expression shifted further, something like recognition flickering across his weathered features. "I have hunted many dangerous creatures throughout my life," he said thoughtfully. "But I have also hunted enough false accusations, disguised as justice, to recognize the difference." He glanced toward Cale, still positioned protectively despite his obvious exhaustion and bleeding wounds. "And I have never once seen a wild wolf behave with such deliberate, sacrificial loyalty toward a human companion. Whatever bond exists between you two, it speaks louder than any accusation Edmund's frightened village ever leveled against you." He turned to his men with sudden, decisive authority. "Release her," he commanded firmly. "Whatever reward Edmund offers, it is not worth participating in punishing innocence dressed up as justice." The hunters exchanged uncertain glances but ultimately obeyed, releasing Alara's arms immediately. She stumbled forward, rushing immediately to Cale's side, dropping to her knees beside his wounded form, with tears streaming down her face. "You saved me again," she whispered, running trembling hands gently over his injured shoulder, wincing at the depth of the wound Peter had inflicted during their fierce battle. "Please, please be all right." As if in response to her desperate plea, something extraordinary began happening around them. The air within the ravine seemed to shimmer subtly, an ancient energy stirring that neither Alara nor Walter could fully explain. Cale felt it first, a strange warmth spreading through his wounded body, entirely different from ordinary healing. Something deeper and more magical, stirring in response to the profound loyalty and sacrifice just demonstrated between them. Alara noticed the shimmer as well, her eyes widening with astonished wonder as golden light began emanating faintly from Cale's fur, pulsing gently in rhythm, with what seemed almost like a heartbeat far larger than his own. "What is happening?" she whispered, though some instinct within her already sensed the answer before the transformation fully revealed itself. The curse, ancient and cruel, had been designed originally to test whether Cale could ever find loyalty genuine enough to counter the false accusations that condemned him, whether someone might choose to protect him unconditionally, despite full knowledge of the danger and sacrifice involved. Alara's fierce declaration moments earlier, her willingness to face capture and punishment rather than abandon him, had finally satisfied that ancient requirement completely. The golden light intensified rapidly, and Cale's wolf form began shifting before their eyes, this time gently rather than through the painful, forced transformation of previous moonless nights. Fur receded smoothly, bones reshaped themselves without agony, until finally Cale knelt before Alara in his true human form, fully restored, the curse broken entirely and permanently at last. Walter and his remaining men stared in stunned silence at the transformation unfolding before them, disbelief evident across their weathered faces. Alara, meanwhile, could only stare at Cale with overwhelming joy and relief, tears streaming freely down her cheeks as she finally embraced him fully, without fur or distance separating them any longer. "It is truly over," she whispered against his shoulder, feeling him wrap his arms around her in return, solid and human, and permanently free from the cruel magic that had bound him for over a year. "The curse required proof of unwavering loyalty," Cale said quietly, his voice thick with emotion as he held her close. "You provided that proof completely, Alara, without hesitation, despite every danger threatening you in that moment." Walter cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly uncertain how to process the extraordinary scene he had just witnessed. "Well," he said finally, "whatever magic or curse just resolved itself here, it certainly answers any doubt I held regarding your innocence, young lady." He glanced toward his men. "I believe our business here has concluded satisfactorily, gentlemen, without need for further pursuit of either party present." His men nodded in agreement, still visibly shaken by the impossible transformation they had witnessed, and together they departed from the ravine, leaving Alara and Cale alone amid the fading golden light that continued shimmering softly around them for several lingering moments before finally dissipating entirely into the evening air. In the days that followed, Cale explained everything more fully, now that his voice had returned permanently, sharing details about his former pack, about Peter's betrayal, and about his tentative plans to eventually return north and expose the truth to the elders who had wrongfully condemned him. Alara listened intently, offering her support and companionship as he processed the complicated emotions surrounding his restored humanity and uncertain future. Together, they decided to leave the forest that had witnessed both their darkest struggles and their most profound connection, traveling toward a distant town where neither carried the burden of false accusations or unjust exile. Alara found herself smiling more freely than she had in longer than she could remember, walking beside Cale as equals now, no longer protector and protected, but partners bound by loyalty proven through the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. As they crossed the final boundary separating the ancient forest from open countryside beyond, golden sunlight breaking warmly across the horizon ahead of them, Alara reached for Cale's hand, lacing her fingers through his with quiet confidence. Whatever challenges awaited them in this new chapter of their lives, she knew, with unshakable certainty, that they would face it together, no longer hunted, no longer cursed, finally free to build the life that injustice had once tried so desperately to steal from them both. Behind them, the forest settled into peaceful stillness, keeping its ancient secrets as it always had, while ahead, an entirely new story waited to unfold, for the girl who had once fled through darkness alone, and the wolf who had chosen, against impossible odds, to protect her until the very end.